Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, morning, depending on where you're listening from. Welcome to this session on climate finance. Today we'll be discussing on a very important topic, that is climate finance. Welcome. We'll have this session on YouTube. So if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, you can just type your questions there, the YouTube chat. So today's speaker is a very interesting speaker, Ms. Ameedat Abdulsalam. I hope I've spelled it right. And I just want to give each one of us just a small background of who she is. Ms. Ameedat Abdulsalam is a Nigerian gender and climate justice advocate, a researcher, and a development practitioner working at the intersection of climate policy, human rights, gender equality, and sustainable development in Africa. Now, she's a very learned person who holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's degree in international affairs and diplomacy. Her work focuses on climate advocacy, youth engagement, and that is why she's here. And the work encompasses inclusive policy processes which promote equitable, community-driven climate solutions and improving access to transparent climate finance for marginalized communities. And to also add on to who she is, she's also as a facilitator and a public speaker who is committed to simplifying complex climate finance concepts and equipping young people like you and me with the knowledge and tools needed to mobilize resources and influence policy and drive impactful climate action across Africa. There's a lot to say about Ms. Ameedat, and all I need you to do is just take your notebook, take your pen, and buckle up for a very interesting session with Ms. Ameedat. Over to you, Ms. Ameedat, and welcome.
Thank you. Am I allowed to clap for myself before I proceed?
Yes,
Can
you
you
are.
hear me, please?
Yes,
Can you
we
hear
can hear
me?
you.
Can you confirm if you can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, please, before I proceed, if at any point you can no longer hear me, please very quickly call my attention to it because I've been trying to switch between networks to find the best for this session. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone from wherever it is that you're joining. I am super, super happy to be here today, and I hope you have been well. Ramadan Mubarak, happy Lenten season to those who are observing those. I hope you are all doing well. And I have also been told that this is the last session of this training series. And I am so happy and glad that I get to round this up in style. Thank you for joining, and I hope this session is worth your while. Like Joy already said, my name is Hamida Abdulsalam, and primarily I'm a development practitioner who works at the intersection of human rights, climate justice, and gender equality. So let's just get right into it. I'm going to try to share my screen very quickly. Um, Hi, Stanley or Joy. Can you share screen from your end, or can you give me access to share my screen, please? Thank you.
Yes, you have the access, please.
All right, thank you very much. A minute, please. Okay. I don't know why this is taking longer than usual. It's just a second, please. Okay. Okay, great. Please let me know when you can see my screen. Oh, I don't know why this is taking so long.
Maybe can I share it on my end?
Yes, please. I think if you can do that, that would be great.
Okay.
I think we're
Um,
up now.
is my screen visible?
Yes. You can
Okay,
maximize it
perfect. We
out
can see.
though. Yes, but thank you. And apologies for the delay. You know these devices sometimes they do their thing. Can you confirm if you can still hear me before I proceed?
Yes, we can hear you. Proceed.
Okay, great. Once again, if at any point you can no longer hear me, please, before I go too far, do well to call me back. Welcome once again. I hope you're all doing well and I hope you're ready for this very important session. It is important and it could be technical. I mean, most of it is, but this is not going to get too technical because this is just the basis of it. Is trying to understand the frameworks, how it works, what goes on, what goes down. And primarily, my personal objective or aim would be for every single one joining this session or this training to be able to pick whatever we learn here and build on it because we cannot know all of climate finance in about an hour and a half. But what we can know is how some things work and have frameworks to build on or by ourselves and as we further. Thank you once again. And like Joy had introduced, my name is Hamida Abdulsalam, and I will be running you through this session on the climate finance. And what we are here to do today is to understand the basics of climate finance, its mechanisms and frameworks, and how young Africans can influence that. So the objectives of this learning would be that at the end of this session, participants will understand what climate finance is, identify key sources and framework of climate finance, learn how climate finance supports mitigation and adaptation, explore opportunities for African youth, innovators, and community, and also understand some of the barriers and solutions to accessing climate finance, and more particularly now in the context of Africa. So let's sit back and enjoy. So before we get into all the details of what is climate finance and everything, firstly, why does it even matter? And why does it matter particularly for us as young Africans? So climate change is not only an environmental crisis. It is a financial crisis amongst other social development problems. And in the context of Africa, Africa contributes less than 4% of the global emissions, and it's one of the continents, if not number one, that suffers the most disproportionate impacts of climate change. It also needs over $2.7 trillion by 2030 for climate action, but we currently receive less than 5% of global climate finance flows. So the opening question I want us to run with on this session is, how do we close this gap of where we are meant to be, and what is actually stopping us from getting to where we ought to be? So, what is climate finance? The term climate finance is applied to the financial resources devoted to addressing climate change by all public and private actors, from global to local scale, including financial flows to developing countries to assist them in addressing climate change. So, everything that has to do with the financial resources of the entirety of climate change and everything that climate change is about is what climate finance is. Climate finance aims to reduce net greenhouse gas emission and or enhance adaptation and increase resilience to the impact of current and projected climate change. Finance can come from both private and public sector, and it can be channeled through various intermediaries, and it is delivered by a range of instruments and some frameworks that we'll be discussing as this conversation goes on. And some of these include grants, concession and non-concessional debts, and internal budget reallocation. But before we go further, I have an explanatory video on that just gives us a bit more insight on what climate finance is. Joy, I don't know if you're able to help put that video up just for us to get a better context in simpler terms what climate finance is and how it works, just on the basics level of it.
Yes. Can you tell me, is it the first, the second? Can you tell me the title of the video?
The climate finance, the title is just what is climate finance? That one.
Okay, just a minute,
Yes.
Tasha.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Jerry, I don't know if it's just from my end, but I can't get an audio from the video.
Okay, let me fix that. Sorry.
All right. Okay, while Joy is doing that, to all our participants, this is just, please pay attention to this video. It's just about 4 minutes and is an explanatory video. So please pay attention. Thank you.
Climate change is not in the distant future.
So was it audible?
Yes, I can get the audio now. But I don't know if it's from my end. I can't really see it yet, but I can hear it.
Okay. Then be sharing it in a few.
All right, then. Thank you.
Okay.
But happening now, and it is already having. Climate change is not in the distant future, but happening now, and it is already having severe consequences for societies and people's livelihoods. Politicians, scientists, civil society organizations, and advocacy groups, such as the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, as well as communities around the world, are grappling with these impacts and costs. Potential ways towards a sustainable and just future exist, but shifting away from fossil fuels and strengthening the resilience of communities, ecosystems, and economies is expensive. Some, but not enough financing for climate action has been pledged and collected to ensure that funds are available for the necessary changes. But where does the money come from? The money should come from the countries that are responsible for the damage and have the capacity to make it right. This is a matter of justice, climate justice. Industrialized economies such as the United States, England, and Germany have profited from carbon-intensive economic development. But this development path is no longer an option for poor countries that need to skip a few steps and go directly to using clean, renewable energy. Meanwhile, small island nations and heavily indebted poor countries are hit the worst by the impacts of climate change. This is even more unfair considering that their contribution to the problem has been minuscule. In these countries, the worst affected people are the poor and marginalized, women, the disabled, the elderly, and the indigenous peoples. Climate change aggravates existing problems such as inequality, discrimination, and poverty. This is why climate finance should be targeted to help vulnerable population groups. Rich countries owe developing countries a historic climate debt. Based on the key principle of climate justice, that polluters must pay, it is their obligation to help pay for the costs of addressing climate change. So, how much money is needed? Careful estimates say hundreds of billions, if not trillions. And the longer we wait to tackle climate change, the more expensive it gets. In 2009 in Copenhagen, industrialized countries committed to contributing $100 billion annually by 2020 to address the issue. Since then, many climate funds and initiatives have sprung up. But rich countries' contributions have yet to reach their goals. And the long-term future of many climate funds is not secure. While rich countries are supposed to take the lead, most of the money today comes from the private sector. And governments increasingly give loans that need to be paid back. However, loans place a strain on poor recipients, and investors often have priorities that do not align with the needs of communities and countries. This is why public climate finance should be mostly in the form of grants, especially for helping communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. But what's this money for in practice? Climate finance is used to fund projects in mitigation or adaptation, and more in cross-cutting activities that combine both. Funding for adaptation builds hurricane shelters or seawalls. It restores mangrove forests or wetlands, helps manage water systems to deal with severe droughts or floods, and provides farmers with better seeds and forecasts to improve their yield despite unpredictable weather. When done well, these projects allow communities to bear the worst effects of climate change and adjust their livelihoods to an uncertain future. Mitigation projects reduce greenhouse gas emissions by shifting energy production towards sustainable sources. Examples of this include funding for clean transport in cities, generating renewable energy from wind and solar power, or planting trees in deforested areas. These projects can address energy poverty in rural areas by distributing renewable energy to people who have never had electricity. They provide clean cooking solutions to the 2.7 billion people worldwide still using traditional biomass fuels like wood or dung. And they also provide entrepreneurs with the cheap loans needed to buy energy-efficient equipment. However, not all mitigation projects are good projects. Large hydroelectric dams can displace people and destroy their livelihoods, while growing food crops for biofuel can increase food insecurity. Misguided climate mitigation can easily make things worse. The most successful projects put people first and give communities and marginalized groups a strong voice in designing and selecting them. With so little money available for climate projects, only the ones that do no harm to people or the environment and the ones that benefit human rights and gender equality should be funded. But there is so much more to understanding climate finance. Check out our following videos
Thank
on the
you,
gender
Joy.
dimension
Thank you
of
so
climate
much. We can
finance
go
and on
back
the
to the
green climate
slides
gap.
now. Welcome from that short video explainer break. I hope we caught one or two points. And more importantly, after they had explained what climate finance is, one thing that I want us to hold very dear to our hearts going further is when they mentioned that interventions should be people centered. We should fund um, projects and policies that are people centered, that are inclusive of vulnerable communities. And I want us to keep that in mind as we look forward to other things that is going to happen here today. Thank you. So going forward, we've talked about what climate finance is. So there's something called the Standing Committee on Finance. And this is a UNFCCC framework. I want to believe through the course of this training, we've discussed on UNFCCC. So we know what the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is. So the Standing Committee on Finance, Joy, can you confirm if you can hear me? Hi, Joy. Can you hear me, please, before I proceed?
Yes, I can hear you. Let's proceed.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you. So the SCF, which is the Standing Committee on Finance, is a UNFCCC framework that was established at COP16 in Cancun to support the COP and the CMA. The CMA is the meeting of the Conference of Parties with improving coherence and coordination in the delivery of climate change financing, rationalizing of financial mechanisms, mobilizing of financial resources, and measurement, reporting, and verification of support provided to developing country parties. So I'm running us through this SCF because they had stated that a key challenge in presenting information on the definitions of climate finance in use are the varied perspective and expectation on what should be the scope of a given definition. So what this means is that for different contexts, for different both developing, developed countries, least developed, those who are somewhere in between, they see climate finance differently because their needs are different, their expectations are also different. So that is why SCF is saying that this has posed a huge challenge in trying to give a definite definition that would suit um, every country around the world globally. So they had said that the definitions of climate finance are often developed for a range of different purposes and use cases. Their scope varies from domestic to international context, like I had said earlier, from high level description to detailed classification of specific climate related activities, or from a focus solely on a climate related aspect to those who also include financing types or accounting related boundaries. So for this is just to say for different country around the world, there are different contexts in how they view climate finance. So also moving on some of the frameworks and mechanisms around climate finance, it is very important that we understand this background. Like I said, this is just to give us an insight into what these things are and what has formed or shaped where we currently are in terms of climate finance across the world and particularly in Africa. So there's a provision of climate finance in the UNFCCC Convention and also in the Paris Agreement. I also want to believe that in the course of this training, we've spoken about Paris Agreement and every other thing. So climate finance is a key enabler for raising climate ambition and action. The convention, the UNFCCC, Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement call for assistance, financial assistance from parties with more financial resources. Emphasis on this because it is also going to let us see what primarily guides climate finance across the world and more particularly Africa. So it's simply a situation of the big guys who are the higher polluters are expected to assist the smaller guys who are less polluters and have lesser resources to support themselves in advancing climate adaptation and mitigation or tackling climate change as the case may be. So climate finance is needed for mitigation and adaptation to significantly reduce emission, to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change and to respond to loss and damage. So in the UNFCCC convention, these are just some. I just highlighted some um, of the key points that were stated in some of the articles. For example, Article 4.3, the key word here has been I highlighted it. It says shall provide new and additional financial resources. That is, developed countries would provide new and additional financial resources to developing or underdeveloped or less developed countries. Article 4.9 also says a special consideration will be given to least developed countries. So now they are not just it's not just a one size fits all thing when it comes to the dynamics of climate finance, because surely even the problems are not a one size fits all problem. So surely the solutions or the mechanisms that are going to be put in place cannot also be one size fits all. Article 11.1 also says a mechanism to provide financial resources on a grant or concessional basis, including for the transfer of technology, is defined. So these are some of the things that are defined out by the convention, and it's going to function under the guidance and practice of COP. And these are some of the things that frames how they approach climate finance generally. And for the Paris Agreement as well, he also stated this same thing of developed countries assisting developing countries in Article 9.1. Article 9.2 also says other parties are encouraged, to provide or continue to provide such support voluntarily. So the Paris Agreement also have a clause of, maybe you're a private investor and you also want to invest in climate finance voluntarily. That is also encouraged in the Paris Agreement. And also, developed countries parties should continue to take the lead in mobilizing climate finance. The provision for skilled up financial resources should aim to achieve a balance between adaptation and mitigation. As we already know, mitigation is trying to stop, new problems from happening, basically new climate crisis, while adaptation is looking at how best we can manage what is already on ground, the crises that are already on ground. So the Paris Agreement states that for climate finance and for resources, we should find a way to balance up with adaptation and mitigation for these countries. Moving forward, we also have to talk about what is the climate finance needs estimate. And I think this is also important because surely we need the money, but there's an estimate to the level at which people need things, and what is given, what is needed, what is expected, what is projected. So given the pressing climate challenges confronting developing nations, assistance from developed countries are increasingly imperative. The needs determination reports by the SCF projects a funding requirement of approximately 5.8 to $5.9 trillion for the pre-2030 period. to facilitate the implementation of the NDCs and the National Adaptation Plan in developing countries. Like we must have already learned through this journey is the NDCs. This is also a framework from the Paris Agreement for that country. Just they review every 5 years where they put in their expectation journey so far and the things they aim to do in terms of climate action in their respective countries. So for all of this funding for different NDCs and national adaptations plans of different nations, we are estimated about almost $6 trillion. That's just what that is trying to say. And additionally, the adaptation gap report from UNEP, that's United Nations Environmental Program, estimates the annual adaptation finance need to range between 215 billion to 387 billion dollars until 2030. So this is not it's not small money on any front because the damages done are very much intense. There are remediation needs, there's reparation needs, there's adaptation, there's mitigation, there's just transition, there's a whole lot of that. And every single thing here costs money. That's just the basis of it. It costs money. It requires a whole lot of funding. So, according to the World Energy Transition Outlook, an estimated $4.3 trillion per annum is necessary for clean energy initiative until 2030, with a further $5 trillion per year needed until 2050 to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. I'm sure we've also spoken about net zero, the plus one minus one concept. I want to believe you understand that. So these substantial financing gaps were identified as pivotal outcomes of COP28 that took place in Dubai. So no matter how we look at it, both from that, I really need us to get a context of what the global landscape looks like. So I think by now we've established that there are gaps, funding gaps, and there are higher expectations compared to what we are currently reaching. Also, on the climate finance needs estimate for 2030 to 2050, the Climate Policy Initiative further estimates that an average future scenario annual climate finance needed through 2030 will increase steadily from $8.1 trillion to $9 trillion. Subsequently, anticipated needs will surge to surpass 10 trillion annually from 2030 to 2050. This highlights the need to increase climate finance by a minimum of five-fold annually as quickly as possible. So all these stories about trillion dollars that I have been saying since is just to get us to the fact that we urgently need to increase climate finance across the world, and more importantly, for less developed countries and developing countries, fivefold of whatever it is that we currently have annually, as quickly as possible to avoid the most serious consequences of climate change. So, not only are we not where we're supposed to be, not only are we underfunded in terms of climate finance, but we need a five times more money basically to get to where we need to be, and hopefully we get there. Hi Joy, can you still hear me? I just want to
Yes,
before I
hi.
proceed. All right, great. I hope the participants are following as well.
Yes, I can see the feedback on YouTube.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you.
Just to
So,
comment, if they have questions, they can kindly type them on the chat box, and then I can forward them to you uh,
okay.
as we at the end of the session. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So if you can see this graph on your screen, what this is basically saying is that it is showing the huge gap that exists between what is provided for and what is needed. The deeper green part shows the climate finance, what is actually provided for, and the is this mint green or should I say light green? It shows the different range of estimated needs, what is actually needed to be on ground for implementation of the nationally determined contributions and the national adaptation plans across different country. And this also shows how long-term emission um, and the long-term low emission climate resilience development strategy for developing countries. So this is just to show us how the different level looks. Look at how low the climate finance, the actual money is compared to the level of needs is high up, and it keeps increasing because these problems, this crisis, the climate crisis is not stopping. It has not stopped for a very long time, and it just keeps increases. And if for anything, the finance landscape has even shrunken compared to what it used to be. We are not moving at an exactly fast pace, and I don't know if it's still safe to even say we are on a steady pace. And this is due to different factors, particularly now the world politics factor. Because as of last year, a lot of funding was pulled out of climate finance from major funders, which is the US. The US pulled out of the Paris Agreement last year, and this was a huge hit on many developing and least developed country. So now the conversation across countries, particularly across African countries, is how can we learn to sustain ourselves? How can we raise funding for ourselves? What other alternatives are there to the reliance on US funding? But we'll get there. We're just That's just to tell us that so the landscape has worsened compared to even what it used to be. It means we now even have lesser money with bigger problems. So still on this find the climate finance landscape, this is just a diagram that shows sometimes how this money moves. It could move through development cooperation agencies, financial institutions, the UNFCCC, private sector, domestic national budget. It could move this way. And sometimes the carbon market. Carbon market is also an interesting part of um, climate change or climate finance that I particularly do not like to incorporate it into climate finance because if you look at the bigger picture, it seems more like capitalist greenwashing to me, which is why I don't like to dwell on it because it just talks about how big emitters buy carbon, sell carbon. But at the end of the day, it just seemed like a very capitalist move that is not people centered. If you remember from the first video that we watched earlier, it said at the end that climate finance primarily should be people centered and it should be inclusive. So this just seemed like a new way out to keep the top polluters up there so they can easily just say, okay, now I'm buying carbon from a lesser emitter or something like that. So just that dynamic is just very interesting. So I will not even want us to focus on that. But if it sparks your interest, learn more about it and take it from me that I said that this is a capitalist greenwashing system. But that's not our focus today. It just crossed my mind and I thought to mention. So still on this climate finance landscape, so we have it could be domestic, it could be international, it could be public, it could be private. So typically if it's domestic finance, it means it's coming from a national budget to sectoral budget to taxes within the country, grants, green bonds, fees and charges, or national climate change funds, depending on the country. If it's bilateral or multilateral, that is the international public space. It could come from the EU, US, UK, Japan, and other G7 countries. If it's multilateral, it could be from this adaptation fund, GES Trust Fund, SCCF, and some of these other. And we're going to speak a bit more about these multilateral moving forward. And also, it could climate finance also come from private sector as well. So it comes from every corner, from every range. But there's always a but of when it comes, primarily because you're getting money from an investor or a donor, it means that whatever it is you want to use your money for mostly have to align with what the expectations of your donor is. So that is just the clause that it's there, but they come from different sources, both private and public. So this diagram is just trying to paint a picture of how the numerous sources that this can be gotten from. So, like I said, one of the multilateral forms, which is also a framework, is the Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund is a premier international fund established under the Kyoto Protocol. I want to believe we know what the Kyoto Protocol is. I'm sure we must have discussed it at some point. It's a legal binding document that dictates to every country who is signatory to it to reduce emission below 5%. That's quite a while ago, but that's just what that is about on the surface level. And serving the Paris Agreement to finance concrete projects that helps vulnerable communities and developed countries build resilience and to climate change. It has so far committed over $1.5 billion to 217 projects as of early 2026, focusing on agriculture, water resource, water management, disaster risk reduction, and ecosystem restoration. This adaptation fund is funded by a board with the World Bank acting as the trustee on an interim basis. So, what are some of the key aspects of this adaptation fund? What does it look into? Some of the focus of adaptation fund is that it focuses on vulnerable communities. So, vulnerable communities are prioritized more than those that are less vulnerable. So, it specifically targets those most vulnerable communities, like those that are vulnerable to floods, sea rise levels, droughts, and the likes. There's also the direct access modality, a unique feature allowing national or regional entities to directly access funds, promoting ownership and capacity building. So, countries can directly access fund from the adaptation fund. And please, it's worthy of note that different funds, different mechanisms, different frameworks have different requirements. So that can sometimes be a plus, an addition, or a subtraction, an advantage or disadvantage, regardless of the case. Also, there are some key support areas that includes agriculture, coastal management, urban resilience, etc. There's also the finance funding mechanism of it, which is financed by a 2% levy on clean development mechanism, emission reduction, and voluntary contributions as well. There's also the readiness program that is also a key aspect of the adaptation fund. It provides grants to help countries build capacity and to also receive and manage climate financing. So the adaptation fund is also one key aspect of the climate finance mechanisms and framework. We also have the Green Climate Fund. This is also another mechanisms, or should I say, yes, let's just say mechanisms. And the GCF has been adopted by 194 governments as a financial mechanisms by the UNFCCC at the end of 2011. And its goal of is to reduce or limit greenhouse gas emissions in developing country and also to help adapt vulnerable societies to the already felt impact of climate change. Particularly, it aims to make an ambitious contribution to attaining the mitigation and adaptation goals of the international community with a goal of keeping the temperature increase of the planet below 2 degrees Celsius. And over time, it is expected to become one of the main multilateral financing mechanisms to support climate actions for developing countries. So primarily, the Green Climate Fund has some thematic areas which is broadly split into adaptation and mitigation. And for mitigation, there's energy, there's transport, forest and land use, cities, industries, buildings. That's like mitigation. And for under the adaptation, it is categorized under health, food, and water security, livelihood for of persons, ecosystem services, infrastructure, and built environment. So this is another framework or mechanism for climate finance. The Green Climate Fund is also one very stronghold there. I think there's also I think it's about just a 3 minute video on this Green Climate Fund. Hi Joy, are you able to put that up? So we just
Yes.
get a better context before I proceed. So you won't be like, I'm just doing all the talking, talking, talking.
Okay, sure. Let me just share the video.
Thank you.
So I need you to confirm if you can hear the audio of the video.
Okay. It's not up yet, but when it is out, not from my end though.
Okay, let me reshare it again. Um,
Addressing climate
how
change
about
is
now?
both urgent and expensive,
Yes, you're up.
especially
Thank you.
in countries where its
Okay, let
effects
me
are
start
felt
it.
the worst. Addressing climate change is both urgent and expensive, especially in developing countries where its effects are felt the worst. On the one hand, new extreme weather patterns and rising sea levels are forcing people and communities to adapt the ways they live, farm, and work. On the other, all energy production, new and old, must be shifted from fossil fuels to sustainable sources. Under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the international community has agreed that industrialized countries, who were the biggest beneficiaries of greenhouse gas pollution, should support climate projects in developing countries. These financial transfers are often made through multilateral climate funds, the largest of which is the Green Climate Fund. It has been operational only since 2015, yet it has funded more than 100 projects. These projects help communities adapt to the effects of climate change and transition to clean energy production. As a new and ambitious fund, the GCF tries to learn from the past mistakes of other organizations where climate finance had harmful consequences, such as environmental degradation or human rights violations. While there is always room for improvement, the GCF has the potential to set an example of best practices for transformative climate finance. So what makes the GCF so innovative? First, the fund aims to take a holistic approach, not just financing climate action, but also supporting social and economic development. It commits to spending the same amount on its two main goals. One, reducing emissions, and two, addressing the impacts of climate change. A quarter of all of its funding is reserved for the poorest countries. Second, in contrast to traditional development banks, the governing board of the GCF is made up of an equal number from developed and developing countries, so that recipients have an equal say in funding decisions. Recipient countries can propose or reject project ideas, set investment priorities, and get support for building domestic capacity and climate change knowledge. These ideas can come from environmental groups, government agencies, or businesses. Instead of having to go through UN agencies or development banks, as with most other climate funds, they can be given direct access to funding. Third, the GCF has committed itself to protecting and promoting human rights and has strong safeguards to avoid harm. Funded projects are supposed to be gender responsive and respect the rights of women and Indigenous peoples by requiring consultations with them. Fourth, the Green Climate Fund is committed to accountability. Internally, it has several independent units to protect integrity and for monitoring and evaluation. It gives people the opportunity to complain and ask for compensation if projects go wrong and cause harm. The fund is also open to active participation from civil society. The Heinrich Böll Stiftung and many others critically review project proposals and provide expert input. A coalition of civil society organizations monitor projects and spread information about the GCF on their website called GCF Watch. Now, what does the future hold for the Green Climate Fund? As it grows and matures, the largest challenge the fund faces is replenishment, as the demand far outstrips the money available. Securing new funding is a long and difficult political process. There is intense competition for public funding, and developed countries are not generous enough to fulfill their international obligations. Much more money is needed to help communities address climate change. The continued success of the GCF is therefore crucial to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. If you want to know more about the topic, check out our other videos
Thank
on
you
the
so
base.
much, Joy.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So that is more on the GCF, and if for anything, I want to believe that we picked that. He had said that it uses a human rights approach, and compared to other older fundings, is it tries to put into account the social and economic development aspects of things. So moving on, we also have the Loss and Damage Fund, which is called the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, FRLD. Like we already know, climate crisis happens. People suffer. Some people are disproportionately affected more than others. Vulnerable communities are put at higher risk. Loss and damage keeps on occurring and occurring and occurring. Drought happens, people lose their farmlands, flood happens, people lose their houses, their livelihoods, their everything basically. So loss and damage is also very important. So there's also a fund called the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. And this is also a UNFCCC's mechanism that was established at COP27, that's 2022, but it was operationalized at COP28. And this is to provide financial assistance to developing nations severely impacted by climate change. It supports recovery from extreme weather and slow onset events, targeting both economic and non economic losses. As of April 2025, it has received over $780 million in pledges. Pledges, not like the money has been given out, but in pledges. The fund also represents a significant shift from climate policy to focusing on solidarity with developing countries that are disproportionately affected by climate disasters, despite having contributed the least to global emissions. So, this is what the FRLD is about. And what are some of the key details of this FRLD fund? Is that it provides grants. In this case, now, not necessarily loans like many other fund does. This is for grants or some concessional finance to vulnerable low income countries for recovery, rehabilitation, and addressing damages beyond adaptation capabilities. It also has some target areas, which is both economic and non economic loss. For economic loss, this could be damaged infrastructure, damaged crops, things in that line. And for non economic, maybe loss of life, loss of heritage, or displacement. And it is also operationalized in the World Bank, acting as the interim trustee for 4 years. And there's also a funding gap on this. Like I said, while pledges amounts are growing, experts indicate a need for hundreds of billions annually, highlighting a significant gap between current funding and actual damage costs. Also, the board is finalizing operation guidelines to ensure that the fund is accessible to frontline communities of developing nations. So now coming to the more specific context of the realities of Africa in this climate finance world. The dynamics for Africa is, I think, for many things, the dynamics for Africa is always an interesting one, always one for the books, if I do say so myself. If you can see the diagram on the, I think is left, is just showing how climate finance flows, some top 10 recipients and top 10 most vulnerable countries. But then between about $1.3 trillion and $1.6 trillion, averaging 1.4 trillion, will be needed over 2020 to 2030 to implement Africa's climate actions commitments and nationally determined contributions. Moreover, after historic and future carbon emission shares are accounted for, total climate finance due to Africa is estimated at about $4.84 trillion. Like I said, these are just big money that we keep calling in trillions, in trillions, in trillions. And as always, the climate finance committed and mobilized for Africa still falls short of what the continent actually needs. And historical carbon emission shares creating an estimated annual financing gap in about 127.2 billion between 2020 and 2030. So what this is just trying to say is that um, in the more specific context of of Africa, what we need, there's a huge gap between what we need and what we've gotten. And so it's just to say that there's a huge gap between where we need to be and where we currently are. So this is just also to show in more simpler terms what the reality of climate finance is in Africa. For adaptation, what we need is about $407 billion. Mitigation, this is just breaking some of it, breaking it down into the loss and damage, technical, technological, and every other thing, and also M&E, which is also very important, and other needs that have not yet been estimated for, like needs for capacity building, which I also believe is very important because we need to actually strengthen um, internally regarding how we address the NDCs, the NAPs, and every other policy and frameworks, particularly now around climate finance, before we are able to even make sound projections as against what is going to be like in the future. So that's just what that is about. Moving on, also, we are going to talk about the gendered perspective of climate finance in Africa. Surely, we know that climate change is not gender neutral, and by extension, climate finance is also not gender neutral. We already know that across Africa and even around the world, women and other vulnerable groups are disproportionately affected by the impact of climate change. And what this means is that these existing inequalities that have persisted to cause this disproportionate impact are still very much present in how we approach climate finance in Africa. And even though recognition is growing on the importance of factoring in gender perspective in climate finance for developing country, which has led to the emergence of gender responsive climate finance, which targets gender inequalities in Africa, there's still the gap and there are still shoes to fill. And such finance, which come from different sources, increased from an average of $80 million to 1.6 billion in 2019, with a peak of 5 billion in 2018. So this is just to say that while we are accounting for this gendered differences, it also means more money put aside to address the different needs or the specific needs of specific people or specific communities. And more on the gendered impact of climate change in Africa is that Africa fares relatively well among global regions in trying to adapt to climate change sometimes, and more than three-quarters of climate development finance failed to consider women specific needs and contributions during the 2010s. More and better financing, though, have now started focusing on gender specific needs in the newer context of climate finance in Africa and across the world. But there's still the persistence of the socio-economic inequalities. And I'm sure we've had a session on this, so I'm not going to dwell on this socioeconomic inequalities. We already know what they are. Women are not even in the decision making of these budgets and everything in between. So there's always just that gap, and one factor or another factor is directly or indirectly proportional to the other, which is further causing harm or further causing a gap or a problem. So improving governance and operational procedures along providing technical experts advisory services is equally important in ensuring effective gender mainstreaming in climate finance. Before we proceed, Joy, I think we also have a video, a very short video on the gender perspective of climate finance.
Yes, I will
All
share
right,
it.
all right, thank you very much.
So as I'm sharing, just to remind you that you can post the questions that you have, and I will share with Ms. Ameedat. Can you hear,
Climate change is accelerating
can you hear the audio?
and
Yes, I
impacting
can.
cities around.
Great. Let me share it.
Climate change is accelerating and impacting more and more communities around the world. The worst affected are the poorest countries, with rising sea levels, increasing temperatures, and extreme weather conditions. Within these countries, the poorest, most marginalized groups have the fewest opportunities to protect themselves. Due to discrimination and gender norms, women and men are impacted differently by climate change. In many developing countries, men work away from the home while women cultivate tiny plots of land without irrigation to produce food for their families. Climate change directly affects their ability to grow crops. On top of that, women often face barriers to basic education, employment, and to owning property. This often leaves women voiceless in advocating for climate change solutions and vulnerable to its adverse effects. By paying special attention to the different needs and contributions of men and women, gender-responsive climate finance not only addresses climate change, but also reduces gender inequalities and empowers women.
Yay!
Effective projects ensure equal benefits. Take, for example, a climate project used to fund sustainable public transport. Do women feel safe while using the system? Can they afford the fare? Does the schedule meet their specific needs? Without answering these questions, the project will not serve a large part of the population. Climate action that disregards half of the population cannot be efficient or effective. Taking women's needs into consideration is not only the right thing, but also the smart thing to do. In short, only gender-responsive climate projects can be equitable, effective, and efficient. To achieve gender-responsive climate finance, there are a number of essential steps. 1. Climate projects need to involve more women on the ground, both in consultation and in implementation. What exactly are women's needs and contributions, and how can these projects respond accordingly? For example, a project that provides women with access to renewable energy not only provides them with electricity, but also decreases their work burden in caring for families and communities. Second, climate funds need to have social and gender experts, not just technical ones. Policymakers need to look beyond the scientific and economic aspects of climate change and incorporate social and human rights dimensions as well. Third, more women should hold a seat at the table to affect the focus and the way climate decisions are made. In most climate funds, there are currently very few women holding these seats. This must change. Fourth, funds should be made directly accessible in the form of loans or grants to women's groups or female entrepreneurs working on climate action. This would empower them to be agents of change for clean energy projects. It is high time for decision makers and funding mechanisms to fully support women as important stakeholders in climate action. Over the last 10 years, advocacy groups such as the Heinrich Böll Stiftung have pushed for more recognition of the gender dimensions of climate finance. So far, there has been some success. Look at the Green Climate Fund, currently the largest multilateral climate fund, which started its operations with an explicit gender equality mandate. This is an important step and a signal to the world, even if there's still a lot of work left to do. If you want to know more about the Green Climate Fund or the basic principles guiding...
Thank you so much, Joy.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So I want to believe that explainer video has provided more context into the gendered dimensions of climate finance. Once again, these things are not black or white; they are multidimensional, and unless we look deep into all of these multiple dimensions, it would just be as though we are pouring water into a basket because we're just going to be doing so much without any real change. Thank you. So moving forward, now we are talking about the justice dimension to climate finance more broadly. Climate finance is not it's not only a climate issue. It is not even only a finance issue, it is also a justice issue. And why is it a justice issue? Because of inequality and different factors has affected climate finance that has made it more favorable to certain persons than certain persons or certain nations than certain nations. It affects or and different social development barriers or actors contribute to what the outlook of climate finance is, how much money we are actually getting, and even being able to use these resources effectively. Things like, coming back to it, I think I mentioned it earlier, things like the global political landscape. What is the current international affairs of the world? What does diplomacy currently look like? Who are whose allies? More importantly, I think these are some of the things that determine this climate finance and the different dimensions of it. So, and more importantly, like I said, because of inequality, climate finance is also a justice issue because many vulnerable communities did not cause this crisis, yet they face worse impacts. And they also have the least access to funding. They are usually the ones who do not have, the countries who face the most impacts are often the ones who doesn't have much to begin with. So this is why discussions around loss and damage, very importantly, climate reparations, remediation, equitable finance, community led solution, gender justice, among many others, are becoming central to global negotiations, and we cannot take it out of it. It is very much important as young Africans looking into the climate finance space. We must always look at these multidimensional factors to it. Like I said earlier as well, it is not a one size fits all. So even within the African context, they are still the developing countries and the least developed countries. The contexts are never the same. It has never been. Even within countries, there are still places of higher needs than other places. So all of this consideration needs to be put into great account. Moving forward, I love this part. Some of the barriers to accessing these climate finance. The list is endless, to be fair. The list is very much endless. There are a million and one reasons and more. It could be more contextual regarding concerning where you come from. Even geographical location sometimes could be a barrier. Imagine the difference in trying to access fund in, let's say, Kenya to what it is going to be in, should I say, DRC, for example. So even the geographical location is now a barrier because in some certain region, the peace and security is even worsened than in other regions. And all of this comes together. Like I said, one factor, the other factor is directly or indirectly proportional or affecting the other factors of it. So it's just always intertwined. Sometimes organizational silos and competing mandates. This is very interesting because even within um, a state or a nation who needs to get climate finance, there are still competing mandates. They are different. And this is not only for the private sector or for the development partners, even with government institution, the public sector, you could have for example, in Nigeria, we have the National Council on Climate Change, NCCC, and we also have the Federal Ministry of Environment. So these are two separate agencies. One is a ministry, one is an agency. Even though at the end of the day, there is, it's like having a common goal as to what we want to achieve, but they work independently. So they can very easily have competing mandates and they would very much also have the tendency of working in silos, even though the goal at the end of the day is working towards the same thing. But you want to stand on your own, you want to stand on your own. So can you see how some of those things can cause bigger problem in trying to access finance? So in many times, rather than working together, we work differently. And even on the part of the donors as well. Sometimes, like I think I also said it earlier, you might have plans, ambitions, things that you want to do, but because you are getting money from a particular source, you are forced to work with what they want. You are forced to work with their objective. And sometimes it's not necessarily what you need as a country, but because the funders sometimes, apart from some certain funds that have provisions of you having the ability to reject or accept the funding, many times, many nations try to bend to the will of what the donors want and not necessarily tackling the needs, the actual needs of their communities or of their nations. Also, there's the underdeveloped financial sector across Africa. I don't even think this particular point needs much explanation. If you look at the economies of many African countries, the economic instability is first a huge, huge problem in us trying to access finance, climate finance, in fact, any foreign finance to be fair, and now particularly climate finance. So the instability of these economies can sometimes be a barrier. Also, macroeconomic factor, which still boils back down to insecurity when things like inflation or regression start to come into a nation, is going to affect um, your foreign exchange, which will surely also in turn affect your climate finance or what you can make out of it, or even whether or not you are in a position to now meet the requirements of funding agencies or mechanisms. Also, the political will of the leaders of a nation to actually even pay attention to climate finance or to climate change in general. Talk less of now being in a position to want to do something and now get um and now start getting these fundings for the nation, because some fundings can only come to the government, while some can come to development partners, individuals at different levels. So different fundings have different requirements. So if there's no political will, we are not going anywhere. Also, if there's no political will to want to have an inclusive climate finance access, it's also going to be a big problem, like we had earlier said. If now we've gotten the funding as a nation, but then the selection process or the consultation process or implementation process is not inclusive, now it is the fault of the government. And this is also still a problem. Also, harmonizing fund requirements. Like I said earlier, different fundings require different things. So you sometimes getting all the specific requirements that this funding wants could be a problem. Funding programs, not one-off projects. Another issue that many people or many nations have is trying to sustain what you want to use the money for. Now you've gotten the money, but or now you're trying to convince me to give you the money, but I'm not seeing a or this institution is not seeing a sustainability plan of what this finance would look like for this community in, like, let's say the next 10 years. It could also cause some barriers. Also, bureaucratic processes or bureaucratic barriers. It can be both from the national side or both from the funder side. Also, funding centralized at national levels. For a country like Nigeria, we have states and we have the federal level. So imagine the federal government getting a fund that they do not disburse to the state level. There's also the local level, the local government level. So imagine the state government also getting the fund from the federal government, but not also disbursing to the local level, where it's actually the community level where these funds are actually needed. So the way these funds are actually disbursed is also could also be a barrier to accessing climate finance. Sometimes the fund might even come into the country but not actually reach the community level. More importantly, greenwashing. Not every climate finance fund is progressive. Not every climate finance fund is for the betterment of climate adaptation and mitigation. There are many, particularly if it's coming from private sectors, there could be a tendency of greenwashing, or maybe they're just trying to make it their maybe community projects or something like that. Imagine a big emitter, let's say Shell, for example, just coming to give you some billions or millions of dollars to say, just take this and use it to just carry out some project or something like that. Just imagine that dynamic while there are so many problems that they've already caused on ground and still causing. So some of these things are the barriers to accessing climate finance. Like I said, this list is not exhaustive. It is very much longer than this, and it could also be contextual to which part of the world you belong to. So, what are the opportunities for young Africans, for me and for you? What are some of the opportunities that has presented itself to us in the context of climate finance? This is not an exhaustive list. Also, it could be so much. It could be so much more than this, but these are just some. So please, we can have climate negotiators from the participants here, and once again, regardless of which sector we are or what we are trying to diverse into, I just want us to keep at the back of our minds that climate finance should be inclusive, and our approach to it should be inclusive and people centered. So, whether you're a climate negotiator, climate innovator, climate activist, financial analyst, policy and financial advisor, whether you're a gender specialist, carbon market specialist, advocacy and campaign specialist, researcher, entrepreneur, public sector leader, project management, regardless of what it is, people first, and also put in mind the concept of do no harm. Sometimes you might want to think you're doing good, or you're trying to improve or impact communities. But at the end of the day, or in the long run, you maybe through approaches or systems or methods of interventions, you might end up doing more harm than good. So regardless of what the opportunities are, please make sure that it is people centered. And who knows, some people here might end up being working for donor organizations, donor institutions, donor committees, and you might now have a say in what we get, or being in rooms where developed countries are talking about how to give funds to these developed countries. I want to believe we now have we have the capacity to also chip into those type of conversations, to be able to bring out the maximum results that reflect people-centered approaches to everything that we do. And some of the opportunities, this is also not an exhaustive list, it's just some that I could come up with. You can as well also do your research. There are always funds somewhere for young Africans to carry out projects, community interventions, innovations, just to improve the state of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, energy transition, just transition, loss and damage, you name it. And as there's a government level to it, funds that are accessible to just government, there are also some that community members, youth from different communities, or um, organizations, grassroots organizations or national organizations can also access. So I just put together a few, which some of which is the Youth Climate Justice Fund, some are grants, also the UNDP Youth for Climate Global Challenge, Global Innovation Challenge. We also have the YEF, the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, the Young African Innovators Program. So please feel free and do well to check these out. And I want to believe that the participants from this training have what it takes to make real lasting impacts. And so please, you can check this out, or check many more. Just check them out, and let's see how best we can incorporate inclusive, people centered approaches into climate financing. And I think that is my last slide. Thank you so much. And I hope this discussion has provided valuable insights, at least at the basis level, into the framework of climate finance and the multidimensional lens to climate finance. And I also hope I have ignited a fire in somebody's belly here today to want to push them to go further and learn more and get more insights on climate finance, or even specialize in that aspect. I want to hope that I have been able to do that at the very least. So I would think I would take your questions now.
Wow. Thank you. I think we can all celebrate Miss Amidat on the chat box. That was a very, very insightful session. Just before we get a question, I'm just getting quite overwhelming feedback from here, and I'll just read from one active person. She's called Kejola30, who is saying thank you, and she's really resonating with whatever you've shared about. Also, Fiona 4178, who says who appreciates the session to be very insightful. Also, Tube 6470. I'm just reading from your tag names on YouTube. Says that this is a very great session, and he or she didn't even notice the length of the time. I mean, they just lost track. They just lost track of the time, and thank you very much for the very, very insightful session. So, just a question to you. Do you think that the African political or the African governance system is the biggest bottleneck to the climate finance justice, especially to the vulnerable people? Because we find that most of the funds are out there, but the politics around these countries do limit the access to these funds, especially to the vulnerable community. So what are your thoughts on that? And if so, what what can we do to mitigate such kind of poor governance from our country?
Thank you so much, Joy. Surely the African governance structure is a huge, very much huge part of it, but it is beyond us. We have our problems, but the issue of climate finance, particularly, is beyond us. It is a global problem. So it is, I would say it's more of the global finance dynamics and the global world power, the world power dynamics. Surely, this also trickle down to how climate, to how our governance work and everything. And like I said earlier, allies is also important. So technically, if we are getting a fund from France, but this particular African country is not um, is not an ally of France or is not does not really have a good relationship with France. That's just an example. Surely the possibility of you getting that particular finance is like maybe let's say maybe 20%, while other stronger allies might have um, a higher percentage. But more particularly, the dynamics of African leadership with corruption and politics. So with corruption and political will, see, climate finance is almost it's just a different context of other finance, but it is still finance. And we know how our governments can be with money. So it's not very different. But what can we do as young persons? Firstly, we need to use our spaces, no matter how small, to keep advocating for a just climate finance. We cannot stop. I know sometimes it's tiring, to be fair, and you might get an oil and gas offer tomorrow that will sound very juicy and everything, but at the end of the day, we need to put our future generations in mind and even our current generations. In Nigeria, particularly now, we are currently facing a heat wave that just keeps increasing over the years. I mean, so whether it is now or the future, the climate impacts are not stopping. And I heard that in Kenya, in a few days ago, there was a very terrible flooding. So you can
Yeah.
see, and the funny thing about climate is that it could be you at any time. It doesn't care whether you are upper class or lower class. If drought wants to happen now, it's not really going to care whether you are this person or you have this. So in our little spaces, we need to also hold strongly knowledge. Please
Mhm.
let us know our onions. It is very important. If by any way you are now intrigued and want to learn more about climate finance, please take that course, take that, ask that mentor, ask whatever you need to know your onions so you can speak about it. So you can advocate both online and physically. You can also spread the word and let others know. So by these things, all of these small changes is the little things that we can do from our own end. At the end of the day, a lot of it still boils down to the government. But I think these are some of the things we can do. Thank you.
Thank you. And also to add on that, I can see Anthony is saying that true political priorities which are away from climate resilience do have bigger consideration and share in the distribution of state resources. And also, Cecilia agrees that political will is a great barrier to accessing climate finance. And thank you for reminding us as young people that we need to take our spaces, no matter how small they are, it still matters. And I think I can see most people are requesting slides to be shared after. And yeah, I think that's all I have from my end. Um, Thank you very much for the very insightful session. I have learned a lot of fun. And I'm just trying to scroll through to find a question. Oh, sorry, one last one. Someone, I think Amos Mugambi, is saying that, can you convince me not to believe that the whole idea of climate change ain't about women empowerment and why women should hold a seat at the table? This is a very interesting question. Why women?
Can you come again with a question, please?
Oh, sorry. Amos Mugambia is asking, can you convince me not to believe that the whole idea of climate change ain't about women empowerment and why women should hold a seat at the table? This is matters climate justice, the
Okay,
finance.
so If I get it correctly, he's saying I should convince him to say
Yeah.
that climate change is not about women's empowerment, or climate justice is not about women's empowerment. Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, it is, but not in its entirety. Not a, unfortunately for us, if I do say so, maybe unfortunately for the person asking, but the point is, some part of it is not that that is all that it is about, but some part of it is also about empowering women. Like we said, and I'm sure through the course of this training, it must have already been said, because I'm sure you've had sessions on climate justice, adaptation, mitigation, and everything in between. Climate change is not gender neutral. It doesn't mean it doesn't affect everyone. It means it affects us, but it affects us differently. So, what activists and climate justice advocates are saying is that when we want to bring solutions, we cannot just bring a one size fits all solution
Mhm.
without considering the needs of people, because it has affected us differently. Not that it did not affect some people and it affected some people. In a community where there are older persons or persons with disability, you cannot compare the way flooding might have impacted somebody who is a wheelchair user or who is blind to somebody who can stand straight. It's the same way we have said, because of existing inequalities, you cannot
Mm.
compare the way a woman has faced challenges because of this crisis to the way a man has. So, what we are saying is when solutions are coming, they have to address the specific needs of specific vulnerable groups. Not that. So surely it's also about women's empowerment, but not it is that is not all that it is about. It is just one aspect of a million other things. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope he's convinced enough that it's not all about women. Thank you so much for the session. I've learned a lot. I hope the rest have also learned a lot. Just to tell the members that if you shared a project, if you sent a project proposal, you'll receive an email soon. And I think that marks the end of our lesson and also our session at large. Congratulations to everyone for coming this far. Yes, thank you. And I think from now we can end it. Have a good evening. In Nairobi here it's 8:33. So have a good evening. I'm sure in Africa that's the 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 time around evening. Yeah, have a good evening. Eat well, sleep well, and bye.
It's 6:33 over here. Eat well, sleep well, and bye too. And congratulations to every participant of this training once again. I'm sure you are now transformed individuals and you've all learned a lot from this. I am truly proud and I am glad that I get the opportunity to round up this session. And I truly hope it was worth your time. Thank you.
Thank you and bye.
Bye.